3:26 a.m. on August 7th, 1985, a very distraught man called the police and he said, "I think my father is in mortal danger. He lives down the road from me. I was just on the phone with him and it seems like something is totally wrong. Can you please go check on him?" The police tell him to calm down and explain really what's going on here, what happened on the phone. And so the man, whose name was Jeremy, said his dad called him and he was talking about his daughter, so Jeremy's sister, and her name was Sheila. And he's like, "Sheila's gone crazy. She's gone berserk and I think she has a gun." And Jeremy's telling police that he didn't know what his dad was talking about and he's trying to get more information from his dad. He's like, "What do you mean she's got a gun? What's going on over there?" But at some point in this phone call with his father, the phone line just cuts out. And Jeremy's left with all these questions that have gone unanswered. He tried calling back, but it didn't go through, and that's when he called the police. The police asked Jeremy if he had heard any shots fired in the background before the phone cut out. And Jeremy says, "No, but my sister is schizophrenic, she's got a bad temper, and she had been fighting with my parents all week, in particular with my dad. And right before the phone cut out, my dad sounded really scared, like something bad was about to happen or was happening. And so we need to get over there right now." And so the police say, "Okay, we're going to check it out right now." So they hang up with Jeremy and the police head down the road towards White House Farms, where Jeremy's father lives. They park a little ways away from the house itself, safely behind a wall and some trees, because they don't want to go too close in case Sheila really does have a gun and starts shooting at them. As the police are getting out of their vehicle, another car comes driving down the road from the same direction the police had come from. The police tell them to stop and the person gets out and it turns out it's Jeremy. He didn't live that far away and he comes running over and he's like, "We got to go in there. You have to go in there right now." And the police are like, "We're not going to do that. You stay with your car." Before the police were prepared to go into this house, they wanted to scope it out and get a sense of what was going on because they really didn't know anything about the house besides what Jeremy told them. So a small group of police officers goes behind this other building that's kind of adjacent to the White House Farms, but pretty close to the actual farmhouse. And they go around the backside and they peek around the corner and they start looking at the house. And it's still dark outside. And there's a couple of lights on inside the house and there's no movement, there's no sound, and they're just staring at it. And then one of the officers notices movement, or what he thinks is movement, up in the second floor. And the group of them back up behind the building. They didn't want to be seen. They were worried if Sheila saw them, it would trigger her to harm the other people in the house or harm herself. So they back up away from this building, making sure to stay out of sight of that second floor window and really out of sight of any of the windows on this farmhouse. And they go back to the intersection where the police cars are and where Jeremy is, and they decide they're going to take the diplomatic approach. And so they call in a negotiator who, with a bullhorn, goes up behind that little building and they start calling out to Sheila, trying to get her to peacefully put her weapon down and come outside. But there's no sound in the house, there's no more movement in the house as far as anyone can tell, and this turns into a multi-hour long standoff where no one comes out of the house, no one goes into the house, and then the sun comes up and the police are starting to get frustrated. And so they eventually call the negotiator back and they say, "Okay, we're going to need to make entry." A small group of police assaulters began making their way up towards the farmhouse. They get up to the door, it's locked. They try the other door, it's locked. All the windows are locked. And so they bring up a sledgehammer, smash on the front door, and they make entry into this hallway. They immediately make a right, and they're getting ready to confront Sheila wherever she is, but they don't see her. They go all the way down this hallway, and it opens up into the kitchen. And hunched over the stove is a man who's clearly deceased, who winds up being Jeremy's father. He had been shot to death, and he's laying in the kitchen. So they find him. They scan the rest of the kitchen and they look all around the first floor and there's no one else down there. And this whole time, they're not hearing any other noises in the house. It's totally silent. They make their way upstairs, and as soon as they get to the top of the stairs, they go right into the first room on the right, and laying on the bed is a deceased older woman who's also been shot to death, and that would wind up being Jeremy's mother. Laying on the ground next to the bed was a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, who would wind up being Jeremy's sister, so Sheila, the one who had gone berserk apparently according to the father. She's laying on the ground and she has a rifle that's over her chest and the barrel is pointed up towards her head, and she has a gunshot wound that's going in underneath her chin, and so she's deceased as well. The police leave that room, they go across the hall into another bedroom, and when they go inside they find two more bodies that are both laying in their beds. They were 6-year-old twins. They were Sheila's sons. They had both been shot to death as well. After that, there was nobody else in the house, so all of the family has been wiped out. Very quickly, this case was labeled a clear-cut murder-suicide perpetrated by Sheila. She had a history of mental illness, she had apparently gone berserk that night, and she had a gun. Everything fit. And so the police were ready to just write this off as a murder-suicide, especially with the amount of media attention this case got. There was a lot of pressure to just solve this case and move on. And so murder-suicide became the answer, and they were not looking for any other answer. But there was one detective that was not willing to accept that this was clearly a murder-suicide, and he had a couple reasons for it. The first thing he noticed, because he was there when the bodies were discovered, was Sheila was carrying a rifle that had a 10-round magazine, and Sheila did not have any pockets on the clothes she had on when they found her. That's important because she fired 25 shots. So that required 2 reloads, except the ammunition to this gun was downstairs, and a lot of the shooting happened upstairs. So after her first volley of fire on the second floor, where presumably you have at least a couple people that are still totally alive, she had to walk downstairs, reload the gun, come back upstairs, do her second volley of fire, go back downstairs, reload that second time, and then she finishes her course of fire. And it made him wonder, why didn't anybody try to stop her while she was doing the reload? Because it required going all the way down, getting the rounds, jamming them into the magazine, putting it into the gun, and then going back upstairs. That's a lot of time that other people could have potentially tried to stop her, or at a minimum, just tried to escape. But it was like everybody just laid in bed. It was like they didn't know what was happening despite so many rounds being fired very close to them. Stan also found out Sheila did not have extensive weapons training. And so she wouldn't be natural at reloading a weapon. And so for her to go down and reload twice and not chip any of her nails, she had long painted nails, that seemed like a bit of a stretch. Because that requires pretty coordinated movements. And for her to never have done that before and just to be able to easily reload, that seems like a stretch too. Stan also figured out there was a window that had a faulty latch on it, that if you pulled lightly on it, it would stay locked. But if you pulled hard and kind of jostled it around, it could open and it could shut, which means the house was not secure when they got there, even though they thought it was. And that was a big part of their whole, this is a murder-suicide, because Sheila locked all the doors and windows before she committed this crime. But if any of those doors or windows were open, it kind of leaves open the opportunity for someone else to have gotten in there and gotten out before the police. But the biggest discovery by far that puts all the others to shame is something Stan found under the stairs inside the house. And everything before that, all the evidence that Stan was presenting to the other officers saying, hey, we should take a look at this. I don't know if this is a murder-suicide. I think there might be potential for somebody else to be responsible. Well, no one was taking him seriously until he came to the table with what he found underneath the stairs. Everybody had to stop what they were doing and say, okay, yeah, we need to look closer at this. And so if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and click on the link inside of the description. It will bring you to the landing page where you can watch this series that I've been raving about. It's on HBO Max and it's called The Murders at the White House Farm. And it does a great job of showcasing this huge find and then the follow-on plot twist. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were asleep in their home in Amityville, New York. The 7th member of the family, Ron, was sitting on his bed in the basement. At around 1 a.m., he gets up off his bed, he grabs a rifle, and he starts walking up the stairs. He goes across the first floor, goes up the second floor stairs, and he gets to the second floor landing, and he walks right into his parents' bedroom, which was totally dark besides this little candle that had been lit next to his father's bedside. And he raises his rifle and he puts 2 rounds into his father's back. And then as soon as his father is still, he aims at his mother and he shoots her 2 times. And then he puts the gun down and he walks out and he goes across the hall into his brother's room. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot into his 12-year-old brother, Mark. And then he aims at his 9-year-old brother, John, and he fires 1 shot into him as well. Then he leaves their bedroom and he walks down the hall to another bedroom where he finds his 13-year-old sister, Allison. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot. He leaves her room, he goes up the 3rd set of stairs up onto the 3rd floor. He finds his 18-year-old sister, Dawn, and he fires 1 shot into her, and then he was done. Altogether, it took Ron about 15 minutes to massacre his family. At no point was he panicked or running around or acting crazy. He was just walking calmly room to room, taking very well-aimed shots to ensure they didn't get up again. He put the rifle down and he went outside and he jogged to a bar where he went inside and he put on this big facade that he had just found his family and they were hurt and could you come help him? And when they got to the house, he refused to go inside, but the people from the bar went inside and they discovered this horrible scene. And when the police show up, Ron goes over to them and he actually confesses and says, "I killed my family." Even though the DeFeo family had a reputation for being very dysfunctional, it was Ron who had the worst reputation. He was known around Amityville for heavy drug use, for being a total alcoholic, and for getting really aggressive and confrontational with people. He was just a guy no one wanted to be around. And so when news got out in Amityville that this horrible thing has happened, and it looks like Ron is the one who did it, no one was really that shocked. But when details of the crime scene, specifically the way the bodies were positioned, made people wonder, is there more to this case that we don't know about? All of the DeFeo family members had been found lying face down in their beds, and none of them showed any signs of putting up a struggle against their attacker, which led investigators initially to think that they must have been sedated, that Ron must have drugged them somehow before he carried out this attack. But when the toxicology reports came back, no one in the family had any substance in their system. At first, the police did not think that was a very big deal. They figured, you know what? The family just must not have heard the different gunshots. He wasn't shooting lots of rounds. It was, one single round here, one single round here, that perhaps they just didn't hear it, and that's why no one tried to escape. But it turns out the rifle Ron was using, the .35 caliber Marlin, is one of the loudest rifles you can own. And in fact, investigators went out and did a test with it, and they fired it indoors, and you could easily hear it a mile away. And so investigators said, well, then it looks like they must have heard these gunshots, but for some reason didn't get out of their beds. They didn't try to fight back in any way. They just kind of took it. And then you have the weirdness of Ron's confession. On the night of the attack, when Ron is sitting on his bed and he can't sleep and everybody else is asleep upstairs, he starts hearing a voice in his head that's saying, "Catch them, kill them." And he thinks he's just losing his mind. But then out of the shadows, straight across from him, from underneath the steps in the basement, this shadowy figure emerges and starts walking towards him, and he can see what looks like its mouth moving and saying the words, "Catch them, kill them." And Ron's looking up at it as this figure walks all the way up to him and bends down and gets right next to his ear. And he says right into his ear, "Catch them, kill them." And then Ron said involuntarily he reached over to the rifle that was on the bed with him, and he stood up and he began walking towards the steps. And he knew what was going to happen. He was going to go kill his family, and he didn't want to do it, but he felt like he didn't have any more control over his body. And that's when he realized he was being possessed by this demon in the basement. While Ron's confession terrified everybody in Amityville, the idea that there was a demon living in the basement of this house that possessed someone to go kill their family, that terrified everybody, but it didn't hold up in court, and ultimately Ron was sent to jail for life. 1 year after the attacks, another family, the Lutz family, moved into the house in Amityville. But they left 28 days later because they were hearing voices coming from the basement. After hearing about the mass murder that occurred in the house, and now the Lutz family saying that there's something in the basement, world-renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, they descend on the property, and very quickly Ed and Lorraine say, yes, this house is definitely haunted. And in fact, to this day, the Amityville house is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. But while Ed and Lorraine were there, they took a very famous picture. Lorraine was walking around the second floor near where the brothers' room was, and she was snapping pictures. And the only people in the house at the time these pictures were being taken were her and her husband, Ed. And here is the picture that she took on the second floor. She claims this boy standing on the left side of the picture is the ghost of John DeFeo. Today, the house still stands, and it's been bought and sold a number of times over the years because apparently no one likes to live in this house for a very long time. On June 10th, 1912, the Moore family was sleeping peacefully in their beds on their quiet street in Villisca, Iowa. Joe and Sarah Moore, the mother and the father, were asleep upstairs in their room, and their 4 children were down the hall in another room. In addition to the Moore family sleeping upstairs, there was also 2 more children sleeping on the first floor in the guest room. It was the Stillinger sisters, and they were over for a sleepover. And unbeknownst to all the sleeping people in the house, there was a strange man who had broken into the house while they were at church, gone into the attic, and was hiding in there smoking cigarettes and carrying an axe. Shortly after midnight, the stranger believed the coast was clear, and they silently opened up the small door and they crouched down and walked out of the attic into the second floor hallway, wielding this axe in their left hand. They began walking down the hallway. They passed the children's room on their right, and they made their way down to the end of the hall where the master bedroom was. They walked inside the room and stood right next to Joe, and then violently raised the axe over their head so quickly and so high that it actually struck the ceiling, and then brought it down blade first directly onto Joe's face, over and over and over again until Joe did not resemble a human being. While this was happening right next to her, Sarah's beginning to stir and look around what's going on. Meanwhile, the killer has now moved to the other side of the bed and is standing over Sarah and using the backside of the axe. So not the blade part, but the backside of the axe head. He raises it up and then brings it down on her head and repeatedly hits her over and over and over again until she too is indistinguishable and does not look like herself or even human. The killer is very calm. He takes the sheets and pulls them up over the faces of both of the people he just killed, and then he goes back out into the hall and he walks down and he goes into the children's room. One by one, he raises the axe and drops the axe on each of the children's heads, and then after they are deceased, he pulls the sheets up over their head. The killer leaves the room and goes downstairs to where the Stillinger sisters are, and then just like everybody else in the house, he raises the axe and drops it over and over and over again on the heads of each of these girls until they're no longer living as well. Afterwards, he raises the sheets over their faces, and now everyone in the house is deceased and has their face covered. At this point, the killer goes back upstairs and goes back into the master bedroom, and he stands in front of Joe and Sarah's bed, and after a little while, he begins striking them dozens more times, even though both of them were clearly deceased at this point. At this point, the killer shifted gears and began focusing on covering his tracks, cleaning up. And he began taking clothes out of closets and pulling whatever sheets he hadn't used. He began tacking these things up onto all of the windows and any spaces on the doors so that nobody could see in. He also began covering up the mirrors, which no one understood why he did that. After the house is totally covered up, the killer goes into the kitchen and he cooks himself a meal, but he doesn't eat the food. He cleaned off the axe and placed it up against the wall on the first floor. He then took a huge bowl, filled it up with water, and then washed his bloody hands and began to clean himself a little bit, and then he left the bloody water just sitting on the counter. And then, strangely, he took a huge slab of bacon from in the kitchen and he put it in the middle of the floor, and then next to it was a keychain. And some people think this might have to do with some ritual he was performing, but to this day, no one really knows why he did that. And then he took some keys from inside the house, walked out the door, turned around, locked it behind him, and disappeared. The Moore household normally was a very rambunctious place with all these kids running around, and the neighbors were very close. And so the next morning, when the neighbors did not see the Moore family coming outside to do their chores around 7 a.m., they were concerned, and they went over and they knocked on the door. There was no answer. They noticed everything had sheets over it, so they couldn't see inside. And so Joe's brother was hailed to the house, and he brought along a key, and he opened up the door and he walked inside, and he immediately saw the Stillinger sisters and what had been done to them. And he got incredibly sick, and he ran outside, and they called police. Police come down, and they find this horrible scene. Even though they have the murder weapon, they have the victims, their bodies are right here, there's blood, there's all sorts of stuff and things that the killer must have manipulated, and you would think there's enough here that you'd be able to refine your search to a couple different suspects and eventually figure out who did this, but they weren't able to. And to this day, we have no idea who did this. The house itself where the attack happened has not been updated since the attack. Somebody bought the property and then maintained it so it could be a tourist attraction. And so to this day, you can go to the Villisca axe murder house and you can stay there. You can sleep there overnight and you can actually tour the area, and it looks the same way it did when the murders happened. Many people believe that house is haunted. And in fact, in 2014, someone who was there staying overnight as a tourist inexplicably stabbed themselves and had to go to the hospital, and they don't even know why they did it. And so that's kind of added to the legend of the Villisca axe murder house, that the house itself will cause you to harm yourself.
On June 7, 2007, 48-year-old Bob Eidman sat at his desk across from a client at the small auto insurance company he owned in St. Charles, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. Bob and his client talked like they were old friends. That was how Bob was with all of his clients. Part of the reason for this was that Bob just loved talking to people. But he also knew that a lot of his clients came to him when they had no other option. And they were often stressed out about making car insurance payments, so he tried hard to put them at ease. Bob went out of his way to work with people who had bad credit, or a history of traffic violations, or maybe who had gotten a DUI. These were people who desperately needed auto insurance because without it they couldn't drive, but they simply couldn't get insured by larger companies. Bob was well aware of this and made sure he never ever took advantage of these people's desperation. Instead, he offered affordable rates, accepted cash payments, and worked with clients to come up with insurance plans that they could actually handle. And so because of this, Bob had gotten a reputation in town as being as much a benefactor as he was a businessman. In the office, Bob's client handed him an envelope of cash to cover her payment for the month. They talked a bit longer, and then the client left. Once the door was closed, Bob marked the payment in his books, opened a desk drawer where he kept his cash hidden, and tucked the money inside. After that, he looked down at his phone and realized it was later than he thought. So he quickly grabbed a stack of business cards off his desk, slipped them in his pocket, and walked out. Bob's office was on the second floor of a strip mall. So once he was outside, he walked right down the steps to the parking lot, got in his car, and pulled out onto the street. Even though St. Charles was only about 30 minutes from the major city of St. Louis, it felt like a small town. This was a place where a lot of residents kept their doors unlocked and even left their keys in their cars. As Bob drove, he saw loads of people outside enjoying the beautiful spring weather and walking along the Missouri River that wound its way through St. Charles. Bob was a member of the St. Charles Chamber of Commerce, so he loved seeing people taking advantage of the natural beauty the town had to offer. And as an active member of the community, he really believed this was the kind of place where someone could help others and still succeed in business. A few minutes later, Bob pulled into the parking lot of a car dealership in town, and when he did, he got a huge smile on his face, because he saw his wife Diane standing outside the showroom waiting for him. So Bob parked his car, hopped outside, and walked right over to his wife and gave her a kiss on the cheek. The two had been married for 28 years, but they'd only started working together about a year ago when Bob opened up his insurance business. And people who knew them thought they complemented each other perfectly. Bob was this big guy with messy gray hair who loved to talk, while Diane looked and acted like a total professional. And even though they went about things differently, they shared a drive and an appreciation for hard work. In fact, Diane had a full-time job at a hospital, but she still managed to carve out a few hours almost every day to help her husband in his office or to do some marketing for the insurance company, which is actually why they were there at the car dealership. Bob handed Diane half of the business cards he'd brought, and then the two of them split up and began talking to everyone at the dealership who might be looking for a new car. This was one of the ways they marketed Bob's company and found new clients. The two of them spent the rest of the day handing out cards and talking to people. By the time they were finished, they were worn out, but they felt like they'd put in a good, honest day of work. That night, back at home, Bob stayed up and brainstormed more possible marketing ideas, while Diane went to bed early. She had to be up and out of the house by 5 a.m. the next day to make her shift at the hospital. Bob knew how hard it had been for Diane, working basically non-stop across multiple jobs, but he told himself this would all be worth it. The risk he had taken by opening up his own business would eventually pay off, he knew it. Then he'd be able to give Diane a happier, easier life. At 10 a.m. the following day, June 8th, Bob walked into his office, went to his desk, and got right to work, going over his financial statements and planning client meetings. And he'd been working for about an hour when he heard the office door open. So he stopped what he was doing, and he looked up from his desk. At 12:30 p.m., so 2.5 hours after Bob had gotten to the office, a postal worker was making her daily rounds through the same strip mall. She delivered mail to all the businesses on the first floor and then headed upstairs to drop a package off for Bob. She opened Bob's door, said hello as she walked in, and then stopped cold right inside the doorway. She began to scream, dropped the package on the ground, and ran back down the stairs, yelling for help. People began coming out of their shops and offices to see what was going on. At the same time, this postal worker just happened to spot a police cruiser coming down the street towards the strip mall, so she sprinted across the parking lot and ran out into the road, shouting and waving her arms to get their attention. The police cruiser came to a screeching halt, and an officer got out and asked her what was wrong. And the postal worker, who could barely breathe, began to describe what she had just seen. A moment later, that same police officer was entering Bob's office, and just like the postal worker had done, the officer froze in the office doorway. He had been on the force for years, but what he saw in the office still hit him hard. Because on the floor right in front of him, Bob lay motionless, surrounded by a pool of blood. The officer quickly pulled himself together, ran across the office, and crouched down over Bob's body. He checked for a pulse, but it was clear Bob was dead. Not long after the officer contacted the station to report the death, Detective Donald Stepp of the St. Charles Police and his superior, Captain Pat McCarrick, arrived at the scene. These were two of the most experienced investigators on the force, but even they had not had to deal with many homicides in St. Charles. Because, at the time, the city had a far lower murder rate than the state of Missouri and the country as a whole. Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick did a walkthrough of the office, and then they examined Bob's body. They saw multiple bullet wounds, but one of the shots looked like it had just grazed Bob. Stepp and McCarrick also found spent shell casings and also live rounds from a 9mm handgun spread out at different spots across the floor. Because of these live rounds on the floor, which are just unshot bullets, so intact, full live rounds, the investigators thought the killer's weapon might have jammed at some point, and so maybe in an attempt to clear the jam, they had ejected these live rounds onto the ground. Or perhaps the killer might have just been an inexperienced shooter and sort of unintentionally ejected these live rounds without shooting them. The investigators dug through Bob's desk, and they noticed there was no sign of a wallet or any form of ID. They checked Bob's pockets and didn't find a wallet there either, so they thought maybe this had been a robbery. But not long after that, they discovered the money in Bob's cash drawer. They didn't know why a robber would have taken Bob's wallet and left all this cash behind. But maybe there was a chance that the killer was not only an inexperienced shooter, but also an inexperienced thief. Soon, the investigators were joined by members of the county forensic team. Forensics officers examined and collected the shell casings as well as the live rounds. They dusted for prints and did a thorough search of Bob's body and clothes for possible DNA samples. While the forensics team worked in the office, Stepp and McCarrick made their way outside and began questioning owners and employees from the other businesses in the strip mall. The woman who owned the printing shop right below Bob's office proved to be the most helpful. She told investigators she had seen Bob pull into the parking lot around 10 a.m. And at about 11, she said she'd heard loud banging coming from upstairs in Bob's office. She said that she figured Bob was just moving file cabinets around or something, and as a joke, she'd even yelled up to him from her office, "Hey Bob, keep the noise down." But now that she knew what had really happened to Bob, she wished at the time she heard those noises, she had gone upstairs to check on him. The investigators asked her if she could think of anyone who might have had an issue with Bob, but the woman said no, Bob was one of the most likable people she knew, and she figured everyone the police would talk to would say the same thing, because that's just who Bob was. A few minutes later, as the investigators walked out of the print shop, Detective Stepp scanned the strip mall, and the front door of a Mexican restaurant caught his attention. Positioned right above the restaurant door was a security camera that pointed out towards the parking lot and the street. So the investigators went inside the restaurant and asked the owner if they could have his surveillance footage from that morning and also the night before. The owner said of course, and handed over the footage. By the time the investigators had spoken to everyone in the strip mall, it was about 3 p.m. Around that time, Stepp and McCarrick headed towards the stairs to rejoin the forensics team inside of Bob's office. But as they were walking, they heard an officer shouting their names from the parking lot. They turned around and saw the officer standing there with a woman, and as they made eye contact with this officer, he quickly came over to them. He said the woman he was with was Bob's wife, Diane. She'd been trying to get a hold of Bob, but he never answered, so she came up here to see if everything was okay. He said Diane obviously knew something was going on here because of the police presence, but she didn't actually know what had happened to Bob. Detective Stepp took a breath, and then he and his captain went to go speak with Diane. They introduced themselves, and then Stepp broke the news that her husband had been found dead in his office and that someone had shot him. Then Stepp and McCarrick offered their condolences. But Diane's response took them completely by surprise. Diane barely reacted at all, and she didn't even say anything. Now, the investigators knew that people handled news like this in very different ways, but neither of them had ever seen something like this. It was like Diane was completely devoid of emotion. Stepp and McCarrick shared a quick look, and it was clear they both thought this was strange. But they were experienced enough not to jump to conclusions based on a single reaction or non-reaction from somebody who just heard such terrible news. Stepp broke the silence and told Diane they'd like to ask her some questions so they could try to figure out, where to start this investigation. Diane finally spoke and said she would help if she could. Stepp called over to the officer who had brought them Diane and asked him to go get them a chair. The officer ducked into one of the offices and quickly came back out again with a metal folding chair and placed it down next to Diane. Diane took a seat right there in the parking lot, and then Stepp and McCarrick began questioning her. As the victim's spouse, Diane was automatically a person of interest. So the investigators started with basic questions about her and Bob's marriage. How was their marriage going lately? Did they fight? Did they have financial problems? But Diane said she and Bob had a great relationship. They fought like any married couple would, but it was nothing serious. She said financially they were fine. And with Bob's growing business, they actually hoped to be in even better shape financially soon. Without missing a beat, Captain McCarrick asked if Bob had a life insurance policy, and if so, was Diane the beneficiary? This was a pretty standard question in this situation when dealing with a victim's spouse or children, because somebody killing a family member to collect the life insurance policy was definitely not unheard of. Diane said yes, Bob had life insurance, and she was the beneficiary, but it was a small policy. The payout was maybe $5,000. Now, immediately, neither of the investigators thought that was enough money for somebody to want to kill over, but they didn't want to rule anything out yet. At some point, Detective Stepp asked Diane if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Bob, and he sort of expected her answer to be similar to the one the print shop owner had given. But Diane's answer was very different. She said she did know somebody. There was a man who might have it out for Bob. She said his name was Kevin Green, and he was a rival auto insurance salesman in town. Bob had recently accused Kevin of stealing one of his clients and had actually gone to Kevin's office to confront him about it. After jotting down Kevin's name, Stepp asked Diane one more question. Did Bob usually carry cash on him? Diane nodded. She said he always had a good amount of cash in his wallet, and he always carried his wallet in his back pocket, even when he was sitting at his desk. After speaking to Diane, Stepp and McCarrick returned to Bob's office, where forensics officers were still working. Bob's missing wallet meant that his murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad, like they'd thought. And so they shared the information about Bob always carrying his wallet in his back pocket with the forensics team. After hearing this, one of the forensics officers walked over to Bob's body, crouched down, and studied the back pocket of his pants. She said she would cut away the pocket from the pants and keep it as a potential source for a DNA sample. Upon hearing this, Stepp and McCarrick looked confused. DNA samples could only be taken from bodily fluids, and unless they were missing something, it did not look like the pocket had any fluids on it. The forensics officer saw their looks and told them that this was sort of a long shot, but DNA testing technology was making huge advances very quickly. So maybe, down the line, they might be able to pull something useful from that back pocket, despite there not being any obvious fluids on it. Now, Stepp and McCarrick would love it if that wound up being the case, but there was obviously no way they could count on that. So, in the meantime, they decided to start with the one person Bob might have had a beef with, Kevin Green, the rival insurance salesman. Several hours after Bob's body had been discovered, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick walked into another small auto insurance office in St. Charles. And there, they found Kevin Green working at his desk. Kevin smiled warmly and then asked how he could help, almost like he might try to sell them something. But when they told him that Bob Eidman had been murdered, Kevin's smile quickly disappeared and he looked genuinely shocked. The investigators laid out their reason for being there. They knew that Kevin and Bob were rivals and that Bob had recently confronted him about stealing clients. But Kevin just shook his head and said it was not like that at all. He and Bob did not have a confrontation. They just spoke. And there was no rivalry. At least not how the detectives were making it sound. He said that he and Bob were competitors, but they were cordial with each other and actually seemed to get along just fine. Stepp asked Kevin if he could give them a timeline of how he'd spent his day. Kevin nodded and said he'd just gone shopping that morning at a sporting goods store, and then after that, he'd come into work. After taking down some notes, Stepp nodded and said they would be in touch if they needed anything else. Then the two investigators left. In the days immediately following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick got members of their team to begin to follow up on Kevin's alibi. As for the two of them, they began to focus on the theory that Bob's murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad. If that was the case, they knew they could be looking for anyone off the streets, but they hoped that the surveillance camera footage they had gotten from the Mexican restaurant would help make the search a whole lot easier. So, Stepp, McCarrick, and another member of their team began the painstaking process of sitting in a cramped office and watching the grainy video footage frame by frame. And after only doing this for a short time, everything on the screen began to look like a blur of black and white, and it was hard to even make things out clearly. But suddenly, as Stepp was staring at the monitor, he thought he saw something, and it was like he had just suddenly woken up. He told the officer they were working with to rewind the footage several minutes back. The officer did, and then all three of them leaned into the screen and watched. And this time, McCarrick and the other officer saw what Stepp had seen. The same car, a Ford Focus, drove slowly through the strip mall parking lot twice within the span of a few minutes on the day of the murder. It sort of looked like the driver was staking out the place. And the final time the car drove through the lot before disappearing from the footage was about 11 a.m. And that was right around the time the owner of the print shop had heard all that noise coming from Bob's office right above her, and just about 90 minutes before Bob's body had been discovered. Unfortunately, the car's license plates weren't visible on the footage, and so Stepp and McCarrick knew that that would make their jobs a whole lot harder. Still, they had a brand new lead here, and that was exciting. So they had members of their team compile a list of every registered Ford Focus in the county and told them to start tracking down each of the owners. They also set up roadblocks in St. Charles in the hope that the Ford Focus in question might end up at one. Stepp and McCarrick knew that finding this car from the footage could take a long time. After all, there were a lot of Ford Focuses to check, and there was no guarantee the one they wanted was registered in this county. So while the search for the Ford Focus got underway, the two investigators turned their attention back to the one suspect neither of them could get out of their minds: Bob's wife, Diane. During the week following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick began digging deeper into Bob's relationship with his wife. They knew that Diane's strange and sort of cold reaction to the news of her husband's death did not necessarily mean she was guilty, but they just couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about her. So they reached out to Bob's cell phone carrier to secure his phone records, and they also started looking into Bob and Diane's finances. And it didn't take them long to discover that Diane had lied to them. Stepp and McCarrick learned that the couple was not doing well financially, like Diane had suggested. Starting and operating the insurance company had put Bob in significant debt. So much debt, in fact, that he had been in jeopardy of losing his business. But that wasn't even the biggest thing that jumped out at the investigators. They got more information on Bob's life insurance. The policy Diane had told them was worth just $5,000. And they learned that in fact Bob had 3 life insurance policies that collectively were worth a total of $400,000, and Diane would get all of it with Bob dead. On June 20th, so almost 2 weeks after the murder, Stepp and McCarrick sat across from Diane in an interview room at the St. Charles police station, and they did not waste any time skirting the issue. Stepp said they knew Diane had lied to them about her and Bob's financial situation. And perhaps even more importantly, they knew she had also lied about the amount of money she would receive from Bob's life insurance. Diane stayed calm and quiet, like she had when the investigators interviewed her the first time. She said she had lied about her and Bob's financial situation for one simple reason: she was embarrassed. This response actually didn't surprise Stepp and McCarrick. A lot of people do not feel comfortable talking about money problems, even to police conducting a very serious investigation. But Stepp didn't back off. He said Diane's response did not fully explain their issue, because it didn't explain why she'd lied about Bob's life insurance. What does that have to do with being embarrassed? But all Diane could say was she didn't realize the payout was as big as it was. Stepp and McCarrick did not quite buy it, and so they asked Diane to take a polygraph test. She agreed, and they set up the test that day, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, despite all the reasons the investigators now had to suspect Diane, they had no clear evidence actually tying her to her husband's murder. So they had to let her go. After 2 weeks of their investigation, Stepp and McCarrick believed they had several strong leads, but nothing concrete. The rival insurance agent's alibi had checked out. There was still a chance he could have hired someone to kill Bob, but it was an outside chance. On top of that, police had not gotten a hit on the Ford Focus from the surveillance footage, and they hadn't gotten anything from the DNA tests conducted on blood samples taken from the crime scene. But finally, as June came to an end, Stepp and McCarrick got a hold of Bob's detailed phone records. And those records immediately raised a red flag. Because there was one number that Bob called over and over again, and it wasn't Diane's. It was a Kansas City, Missouri number belonging to a man that neither investigators had heard of. His name was James Hall. And so Stepp contacted James and asked if he knew who Bob Eidman was. And James said yes, he knew Bob very well. In fact, the two of them had been lovers. In early July 2007, so almost a month after Bob's murder, Stepp and McCarrick made the 3.5-hour drive from St. Charles to Kansas City. Once they were there, they teamed up with some local police and then paid a visit to James at his house. James had known about Bob's murder soon after it happened, so he wasn't surprised the police wanted to talk to him. And James did not try to hide anything. He said that he and Bob had met online and had been having an affair for about 8 months. James even showed the police a bunch of love letters and gifts that Bob had given him. Initially, Stepp and McCarrick didn't find anything strange about this. But the more James talked, and the more personal items that he showed them, it started to look like he never threw away anything connected to Bob. And the investigators thought this went past the point of romance and into a possible obsession. Finally, McCarrick asked James if anything in their relationship had changed before Bob was killed. And James said yes. There had been a huge change, because Bob's wife, Diane, had recently discovered an email exchange between him and Bob, and so she'd learned about the affair. After that, Bob told James he would have to cool things off for a bit with them and focus instead on his marriage to Diane. As Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick made the drive back to St. Charles, they began to realize that they now had a full-on love triangle to consider. There was a chance that James had gotten angry when Bob started to back away from their relationship, and maybe he lashed out and killed Bob. But Diane, who already had a clear financial motive, might have also gone into a rage and murdered Bob because he was cheating on her. Both of those theories made sense, but without any real evidence, Stepp and McCarrick felt like they were just stumbling around in the dark. By the late summer of 2007, Stepp and McCarrick were growing increasingly frustrated with the case. The investigation just kept going the same way it had from the beginning. They had several strong suspects and no concrete evidence. They continued to try to find the Ford Focus, along with some clue that might link Diane, James, or anyone else to the crime scene. But nothing turned up on either front. And as the months passed by, new leads stopped coming in. Other investigations demanded the cops' focus, and so Bob's case started to go cold. Fast forward to April of 2008, 10 months after Bob's murder. Detective Stepp was at his desk when a phone call got transferred to him. He picked up, and he heard the voice of a county forensics officer on the other end, and she sounded excited. As Stepp listened to her, a stunned look came across his face, because things like this just didn't usually happen in investigations. The forensics officer explained that the long shot the team had taken by cutting away Bob's back pocket from his pants had paid off, because now, almost a year later, the process known as touch DNA sampling had taken a massive leap forward. Essentially, in the past, usable DNA samples could only be obtained from bodily fluids. But now, new touch testing methods allowed the lab to obtain DNA samples from skin cells. And so the lab had tested Bob's back pocket, and they found that whoever had taken Bob's wallet out of that pocket had left their skin cells behind. So they now had a sample of that person's DNA. Detective Stepp hung up the phone, still in shock. This case that he'd basically given up on suddenly felt like it was about to be solved, and all because a forensics officer had seen what the future might bring and had saved a pants pocket. Stepp went to McCarrick's office and told the captain about this huge development. And right away, McCarrick got to work reassembling the investigative team. But even with this new DNA sample, it would still take the investigators some time to put everything together. But eventually, they would sit down face to face with the person who had left their skin cells behind at the crime scene. And at that point, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick knew who killed Bob Eidman. Based on the DNA sample, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bob Eidman on June 8, 2007. At 11 a.m. that day, the killer and their accomplice sat in a parked Ford Focus in the lot of the strip mall, just past Bob's office. They each held a gun, and they each had a bandana tied around their neck. At some point, the killer raised their bandana up over their nose to cover their face, and at that point, the accomplice did the same. Then the killer looked over at the accomplice, nodded, and then they both got out of the car and ran up the steps to the second floor of the strip mall. They quickly made it to Bob's office, opened up the door, stepped inside, and shut the door behind them. Bob, who was doing some work at his desk, looked up, but before he could say or do anything, the killer and the accomplice raised their guns, and the killer fired. The bullet grazed Bob on the chin, and he immediately began to scream and put his hand up to the wound, but the killer just moved closer to the desk and fired again. And this shot hit Bob on the neck. Blood poured from his wound as he fell out of his chair and hit the floor. The killer immediately ran around the desk and aimed right at Bob's face and fired the gun again, this time shooting Bob through the eye. Bob would die laying right there on the floor of his office. Once Bob was dead, the killer crouched down and took Bob's wallet out of his back pocket. Then the killer and the accomplice searched the office, looking for cash they knew Bob kept on hand. But they couldn't find anything, and then they heard shouting coming from right below them. And so in a panic, the killer just grabbed Bob's wallet, put it in his pocket, and then screamed at the accomplice that they needed to run. So the two of them fled the office, slamming the door behind them. They went down the steps, got back in the Ford Focus, and the killer hit the gas and they sped off down the street. And when they'd gotten miles away from the strip mall, the killer took Bob's wallet out of their pocket and looked inside of it. The killer took out the cash they saw and handed half of it to their accomplice. Bob Eidman's murderer was not a jealous wife, an obsessed lover, or a business rival. It turned out the investigators' first theory was right. Bob had been killed by someone who simply wanted to rob him. And that was a man named Paul White. But Paul was not a complete stranger to Bob, because Paul's wife was one of Bob's clients. And months before the murder, Paul had gone with his wife to Bob's office when she made a cash payment for her car insurance. So Paul knew Bob must keep cash on hand. On the night before the murder, Paul had lost $1,200 playing blackjack and craps at a casino, and so he was desperate for money. And his solution was he would kill Bob and take all his cash. After staying up all night, Paul got a hold of 2 guns. Then he got his friend, a man named Cleo Hines, to come with him to provide extra muscle. And then the two of them went to Bob's office and killed him and then robbed him. However, they didn't find the cash in Paul's desk drawer, and so they ended up committing this cold-blooded murder just for the money they found in Bob's wallet, which was $300, or after splitting it, $150 each. And they took that money right back to the casino and quickly lost all of it. The investigators had been on the trail of that Ford Focus, which would turn out to belong to Paul's accomplice, Cleo. But after almost a year of searching, they still hadn't tracked it down. But when the crime lab conducted their DNA touch testing on the skin cells they pulled from Bob's pocket, those samples eventually led them to Paul, who happened to be in prison at the time for committing forgery. Investigators were quickly able to connect Paul to his accomplice Cleo and to the Ford Focus they'd seen on the surveillance footage. Bob's wife Diane, who had nothing to do with the crime, would break down in tears during Paul and Cleo's trial. Paul and Cleo were both convicted, and each of them were sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, with no possibility of parole. On a hot day in July of 2011, Dr. Barbara Elliott stood on a lakeside dock in Minnesota behind 3 of her 4 teenage daughters. The girls were all looking out over the water where their 4th sister, 13-year-old Emma, was learning how to water ski. Their father, William, was driving the motorboat, and behind it was Emma, getting pulled right along. At some point, Emma stood up on her skis, but only long enough to hit a big wave and go tumbling down beneath the surface again. But all the sisters cheered when their dad circled back around, and Emma motioned from the water that she wanted to try again. And this time, once the boat started going, Emma was able to stay upright a lot longer, and her older sisters went crazy, jumping and clapping as Emma sailed across the water. Emma's mother, Barbara, beamed with pride, and not just because Emma had learned to water ski in just a single afternoon, but because she was just very proud of Emma's determination. Emma had Down syndrome, which meant that she was born with an extra copy of chromosome 21. The extra chromosome affected the way her brain developed, so she was growing up with some mental and physical challenges. And so Barbara, who was a developmental pediatrician, knew full well how much harder learning how to water ski would be for Emma than it would be for her sisters. But Barbara realized very early on that she should never doubt Emma. Emma had always been outgoing and athletic. She loved soccer and swim practice. She took ice skating lessons and karate classes. She was also a social butterfly and was looking forward to starting middle school in the fall. Basically, whenever Emma set her mind to something, she always thrived. Emma skied for a few more seconds before losing her grip on the tow rope and splashing back into the water. But a second later, Emma came back up for air and gave her family a big thumbs up. Barbara could see Emma's big smile all the way from the dock. 5 months later, in December, Barbara meandered her way through a Christmas tree farm, enjoying the smell of freshly cut pine trees. Her daughters were up ahead, choosing which Christmas tree they should strap to the roof of the car and bring home. William was next to them, setting up his camera on a tripod. This had become a sort of annual tradition in their family. They would come to this farm to pick out their tree and take a family Christmas photo. In the past, the way this typically went is Emma would run all around the farm until she found the perfect tree, at which point she would loudly announce it to the rest of her family, and then that would be the tree they would choose. But this year, Emma seemed checked out from the whole process. She kept staring off into space while her sisters tried to get her attention. Her oldest sister, Mallory, kept asking her questions, but Emma just ignored her. And then when she finally answered, her words were slow and labored, like she was talking with peanut butter in her mouth. Barbara wondered if this was just typical teenager stuff. Emma was 13 after all. Her personality was bound to change a little bit. But Barbara still couldn't help but feel worried about her youngest daughter. She wondered if maybe something was going on at school that had her mind occupied. William finally got the camera all set up and then told the girls to smile for a photo. But Emma just stared at the ground. Barbara called Emma and told her to look up, and she did, but by the time the camera flashed, Emma was staring back at the ground again, lost in her own world. William had to take the picture 3 more times just to get a shot with Emma looking at the camera. And even then, she wasn't smiling. One morning, a few weeks later, Barbara was in the kitchen pouring herself a bowl of cereal. The rest of her family was already eating around the table. Well, all of them were eating except for Emma, who was just slumped over in her chair, picking at her food and staring at the half-melted Christmas candles in the center of the table. She'd been quiet all morning, even though Mallory had been asking her questions, like whether she was excited to return to school and see her friends again. And so eventually, Mallory just began asking Emma really basic questions that, frankly, she didn't care about the answers at all, like what day of the week is it and what time is it? But Emma didn't even look up. At this point, Barbara exchanged a worried glance with her husband William and also her other daughters. Emma had been withdrawn like this for all of winter break. She avoided eye contact and barely spoke to any of them. She hadn't helped them decorate the Christmas tree, and she got moody whenever anybody asked her questions. And even stranger, Emma hadn't wanted to see any of her friends over break. But as Barbara thought back even farther, like over the whole last few months, she realized Emma had been through a very difficult time. Emma had just started middle school, and she was immediately taken out of general education and put in special education classes for the first time in her life, which could have felt like a demoralizing setback. Maybe she was so upset about what was going on at school that was having a profound impact on her life. She wasn't sleeping very well, perhaps because she was thinking about this stuff, and perhaps the lack of sleep was making her irritable and not really interested in talking to anyone. But trouble at school didn't really explain why Emma now was just completely ignoring her sister. Barbara knew Emma would never give Mallory the cold shoulder for no reason. This behavior was radically out of character. Emma adored her big sister. Barbara had worked in pediatric medicine long enough to know that whatever was going on with Emma was not normal, and so she would have to see her doctor. When Barbara and Emma went in to see her pediatrician, he immediately ordered a full medical workup for Emma. He ran all sorts of tests, like an EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain, also a sleep study, a vision and hearing screen, and full blood work. But none of these tests showed anything wrong with Emma. But just to make sure they covered all their bases, the pediatrician also ordered an MRI of Emma's brain, which creates a detailed scan of the body using magnetic waves. And the MRI did show a few small abnormalities in her brain, but nothing that would explain the apathy, lack of focus, and intellectual decline Emma seemed to be experiencing. And so after that, the pediatrician said he had no further tests to recommend. Whatever was going on with Emma, it didn't seem like a problem he could fix. Several weeks later, after the winter break was over, Barbara was upstairs helping clean Emma's room. Emma used to clean it herself, but she wasn't doing her chores anymore. On top of Emma's increasing social isolation, she'd also begun having these frequent crying episodes. But just as the tears would dry up, she'd burst into fits of laughter. And also, Emma had become hypersensitive to noise and touch. She wouldn't even let her mom brush her hair. She barely slept at all, which Barbara knew was taking a further toll on her mood and energy levels. Her daughter seemed like a shell of her former self. It was emotionally very painful for Barbara to clean Emma's room these days, dusting the trophies and mementos that lined her shelves. They were all reminders of who Emma used to be, a girl who was thriving. Once Barbara was finished dusting, she picked up Emma's backpack, which was overturned on the floor. And as she lifted it up, a small bundle of papers fell out. She was about to set the papers on Emma's desk when she realized the papers were actually letters written by Emma to her favorite teachers. Now, Barbara would never invade her children's privacy if she could help it, but given everything going on with Emma, she gave herself permission to dive into these notes. They were all about Emma's struggles in school. Some of the students in her new special education classes were too aggressive, she wrote. They would throw fits and shout, and this really upset her. But the teachers yelled at her too, which upset her even more. She didn't like school anymore, and she just wanted to go back to 5th grade. Barbara noticed that all these letters were written back in September and October, about 6 months ago, right around the time that Emma first became lethargic and reclusive. Barbara realized that Emma had known all those months ago that something was wrong. She'd written these letters basically asking her teachers for help, but for whatever reason, it appeared like she was either too shy or too overwhelmed to actually deliver them. Reading her daughter's notes was heartbreaking for Barbara, but it was also fairly informative. She began to wonder if maybe she was wrong to think that her daughter's struggles were a medical issue. If Emma was having this much trouble adjusting to her new school, maybe her condition was actually psychological. Several months later, in the summer of 2012, Barbara sat at the dinner table watching Emma eat. Emma was bent over her plate, shoveling food into her mouth, and swallowing it so quickly she barely had time to chew. Emma had been an eating machine over the past few months, but tonight she was really gorging herself. Even though Barbara was a pediatrician herself, she could not explain why her daughter's behavior had changed this much. After Barbara had found Emma's letters, she and her husband had taken Emma to every therapist and psychiatrist they could find. And one psychiatrist who specialized in children with disabilities diagnosed Emma with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, due to the difficult transition from elementary school to middle school. She'd prescribed Emma antidepressants, and at first, they appeared to work. But then she complained that the medication made her feel dizzy, and so they stopped it. And unfortunately, the next medication they tried made her insomnia worse, and the next one after that gave her stomach pain. The only drug that Emma could tolerate was memantine, a medication used to treat memory loss in dementia patients. And in reality, it only helped a little bit. Nothing was able to bring Emma back to her old self. Barbara was frustrated that after consulting with so many doctors and therapists, that no one could find a treatment that worked for Emma, or could even diagnose exactly what was wrong. She was beginning to realize that if she and her family were going to get Emma back, she was going to have to find answers herself. Almost a year later, in 2013, Barbara stood in front of a big lecture hall, clicking through slides on a projector. She was a speaker at a conference of Down syndrome researchers, and she was presenting her daughter's case to the community. She fought to keep a neutral face when she played videos of her daughter water skiing and enjoying time with her friends and family, the way she'd been just a few years ago. But as painful as that was, Barbara pressed on, explaining all the details of Emma's startling regression. And as she presented her daughter's case, she couldn't help but notice a few audience members wiping tears from their eyes. A couple days later, Barbara received an email from a woman who had seen her presentation. The woman's name was Lucy Duncan, and like Barbara, Lucy was searching for answers. When Lucy's daughter Sierra was 20 years old, she went through a very similar regression to Emma. Lucy had tried many treatments for her daughter, but all of them were unsuccessful. Lucy had found a medical researcher who'd taken some interest in Sierra's case, but so far nothing had come from that either. Barbara thought Lucy sounded just like her. They were both mothers desperate to bring their daughters back. But also, as Barbara read this email, something else clicked. There were other people out there with Down syndrome who were also suffering from this mysterious, steady decline. And so Barbara wrote back to Lucy and promised they would stay in touch. They'd compare notes in the coming months and hopefully figure out what was causing their daughters to regress. Or, better yet, find a treatment plan that actually helped their kids. More than a year later, Barbara was sitting inside of a doctor's office, watching as a nurse used what looked like two robot arms to touch Emma's head. These arms were giant magnets that stimulate nerve cells in the brain to try to relieve symptoms of major depression. Recently, Barbara had taken Emma to a new psychiatrist who diagnosed her with catatonia, a disorder that interrupts normal brain function. People with catatonia struggle to communicate and lose their motor skills. This psychiatrist had recommended a 4-week course of this cranial nerve stimulation in hopes it would improve Emma's mood and help her engage with her friends and family again. Thankfully, this sort of bizarre treatment did not seem to bother Emma, who was now 16 years old. She was watching Taylor Swift videos on her phone, seemingly unaware that the nurse was pulling a strap across her head and getting ready to turn on these robot arms. The nurse flipped on the machine, and a metallic clicking sound filled the room. Barbara winced, but Emma seemed absolutely fine. So Barbara stopped worrying and leaned back in her chair. On the way home, Barbara didn't notice much of a change in Emma. But one night, after a few weeks of treatment, Barbara went upstairs to get ready for bed. She passed Emma's room, expecting to see the desk lamp on and Emma sitting at her desk watching YouTube. But instead, the room was dark. Curious, Barbara poked her head in, and to her shock, Emma was in bed, sound asleep, not staring at the ceiling, racked with insomnia, not pacing or zoning out or acting moody, just peacefully sleeping. Barbara felt an overwhelming sense of joy. Now, Emma might not be able to communicate with the outside world just yet, but Barbara hoped this was a sign that maybe she was feeling more peaceful inside. It was a small glimpse of who Emma used to be, and Barbara hoped that it meant the nerve stimulation treatments were working, and that the old Emma was on her way back. Two years later, in 2016, Barbara sat down in the living room and opened up her laptop. Emma was 18 years old now, and they were still searching for a comprehensive treatment plan. Nerve stimulation had helped Emma, but she was by no means back to her normal self. She was still very withdrawn anytime they were out in public, and she suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, is a condition where people have unwanted thoughts and feel the need to do certain actions to ease their anxiety about them. They can interfere with their daily life. But, as always, her mom, Barbara, had a plan. A few days earlier, Barbara had spoken with Lucy, the woman who contacted her after her presentation at the Down syndrome conference. Lucy's daughter, Sierra, was also still struggling, and so they wanted to see if there were any other parents of Down syndrome children out there who had watched their kids regress and their personalities disappear. So they had started a Facebook support group. And now, Barbara clicked on that group's page, and she was immediately overwhelmed. It had been up for only a few days, but already dozens of parents had joined, posting stories of their once thriving children. And each post had a similar ending. Their kids suddenly regressed and became a shell of who they used to be without any explanation. Barbara couldn't believe how many stories like hers were pouring in. She called Lucy, and the two of them stayed on the phone, scrolling through the messages together. Parents asking for help, swapping tips and treatments, and sharing information about physicians who managed to help their kids in some way. Barbara loved the feeling of not being alone as she read through these posts. But she also realized something. Everyone seemed to have tips for mild improvement, but nobody had met any physician who had actually cracked the code and figured out what actually caused this regression in the first place. And so all these Facebook posts forced Barbara to confront a potentially heartbreaking reality. None of these kids and young adults were getting any better. It seemed like Emma's future was going to be about just adjusting to this new normal, not about regaining what she had lost. But Barbara could not accept that. Several years later, in April of 2020, a pediatrician named Dr. Christopher DeSantis sat in his Los Angeles office. Dr. DeSantis was the director of neuroimmunology at one of the largest pediatric medical centers in the country. And on this day, he was looking over the results of a spinal tap, a test he had run on one of his patients, a teenager with Down syndrome named Jackson. 1 year earlier, Jackson had become quiet and insular and basically stopped interacting with the world around him. And so Dr. DeSantis was trying his best to figure out what was wrong with Jackson. But this was proving to be very difficult to do because it was the COVID pandemic, and basically the whole world was shut down. The hospital required so much protective equipment and social distancing measures that it was very hard to schedule in-person appointments at all, let alone order lab work or other procedures to figure out what was going on. At least here, alone in his office, Dr. DeSantis could just focus on his patients and retain some feeling of normalcy. As he looked over the spinal tap test results, he realized there could be hope that he was close to figuring out the cause behind Jackson's change in behavior. The results suggested that there was inflammation in Jackson's brain, which is usually caused by some type of infection. But it can also happen when the patient's own immune system mistakenly attacks healthy tissue that it thinks is an infection, which is known as an autoimmune disorder. And people with Down syndrome have a much higher rate of common autoimmune disorders, such as thyroid disorders, celiac disease, and skin conditions. So, to Dr. DeSantis, it actually made perfect sense that maybe Jackson's regression could be caused by an autoimmune disorder. The doctor wondered if there was a way to reset Jackson's immune system so that the inflammation in his brain might decrease. And so he decided to try a standard treatment for immune disorders called intravenous immune globulin, which gradually purifies the immune system. If it worked, Jackson just might be able to reconnect with the world around him, instead of living inside of this isolating fog. 2 weeks later, Dr. DeSantis was back in his office catching up on work when he heard a commotion in the hallway. A mix of cheering and applause and stamping feet. Confused, he opened his door to see what was going on, and immediately felt a pair of arms wrap around his waist. He looked down to see his patient, Jackson, locking him in a bear hug. Then Jackson pulled back, smiling and laughing and telling him he felt better. Dr. DeSantis couldn't believe it. This was a completely different kid from the near catatonic teenager that checked into the hospital a month ago. The immune globulin treatment, in combination with a few other treatments, had brought Jackson back to life, so to speak. In fact, it was so successful that right away, Dr. DeSantis wondered if maybe other patients with Down syndrome could benefit from this treatment. And sure enough, a few months later, when Dr. DeSantis was surfing Facebook, he stumbled upon a support group for families with Down syndrome children who had regressed. Dr. DeSantis immediately reached out to the group and asked if he could post about his own research. Lucy Duncan was excited and told Dr. DeSantis to please post it. By this point, the Facebook group that she had set up with Barbara had hundreds of members who were eager for more and new information. And so the moment Dr. DeSantis began posting about his experimental treatment that had presumably cured his patient, Jackson, responses on this page poured in. Not long after that, Lucy flew with her daughter, Sierra, out to Los Angeles to meet with Dr. DeSantis. He administered the same course of treatment for Sierra as he had for Jackson, and right away, Sierra did show signs of improvement. But then her progress just stopped. She didn't have the same dramatic turnaround that Jackson experienced. Dr. DeSantis suggested that maybe because Sierra had been in regression much longer than Jackson, that was why the treatment was not as effective. Lucy was bitterly disappointed, but then she remembered another researcher who had once taken an interest in Sierra's case. His name was Dr. Antonio Rivera. Now, he didn't have any answers at the time for what was going on with her daughter, but he had told her that he was going to continue his research. Lucy thought that maybe Dr. Rivera should know about Dr. DeSantis' research. So she pulled out her phone and sent an email to both doctors, introducing them. She hoped that, just maybe, they might find a way to help patients like her daughter and the hundreds of other people on their Facebook group, whose children had been in regression for 5 or even 10 years. Following Lucy's introduction, Dr. DeSantis reached out to Dr. Rivera, and he was delighted to learn that Dr. Rivera had continued his Down syndrome research. Dr. Rivera suspected that this regression was caused by the extra chromosome 21 that people with Down syndrome are born with. He believed the extra chromosome caused them to generate an overly powerful immune system that can sometimes turn on the body itself, making people sick instead of protecting them from disease. This would explain the inflammation Dr. DeSantis had discovered in the brain of his other patient, Jackson. Dr. Rivera suspected that medical researchers had not noticed this autoimmune disorder until now, at least in part because of the history of bias in the medical field about people with Down syndrome. And Dr. DeSantis agreed. If a typical teenager suddenly became a lethargic and moody loner, their doctors would treat it like a major issue. But Drs. DeSantis and Rivera both suspected that doctors generally paid less attention to antisocial behavior in people with Down syndrome because they already had an intellectual disability. Dr. DeSantis was thrilled to meet a doctor whose research aligned so closely with his own. The two of them decided to work together to bring attention and resources to this autoimmune disease. In 2022, Dr. DeSantis took the lead on a paper that named the condition Down syndrome regression disorder. In the paper, he explained that it affects between 1% and 5% of those with Down syndrome. In June of 2023, Emma finally received an official diagnosis after 12 years of regressing. In October of that year, she began immune globulin treatment. At that point, Emma was 25 years old, and her recovery was not as dramatic as some of Dr. DeSantis' younger patients. But the treatment still did make a significant improvement in her quality of life. She was now able to at least smile and joke around again. Recently, Emma graduated from a local university transition program for people with disabilities. She's making friends again, performing in community theater, and water skiing, something she hadn't been able to do for 10 years.
At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy.
She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And anytime she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs, they had no electricity, and basically no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut, but the reality is she wasn't nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby. And so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely, even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone, and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so one of these villagers, who was very concerned, walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she didn't say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second, and right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who's standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers, and soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped, and Sumitra, she kind of shook her head, she fluttered her eyes, and she looked around, and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there's this crowd of people all around her. She has no idea why, and so feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what's going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, she held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she didn't tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly, she couldn't really remember what happened. And so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull, and he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he couldn't for almost 10 minutes, and then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And even more bizarre, lately, during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man
man who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking, and during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother, and also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home and help out with Sumitra and his son. Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance, Sumitra had predicted she would die. On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She didn't cook because she didn't want to be near flames. She didn't walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She didn't even walk downstairs for the same reason. She also kept a very safe distance from her son in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine, and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her, and as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the village, had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances, and so really, the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this, but then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored, and so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over, but when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped and she put her hands down by her side and she went back to this rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked, and then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right up to Sumitra and began checking her out. He checked her pulse, he checked her heartbeat, he kind of looked inside of her mouth, he looked in her eyes, and then after a minute, he stepped back and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's husband fell to his knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while, Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important for both religious and public health reasons to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals, and then afterwards they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral.
funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers weren't talking much, and a lot of the women were crying, but it wasn't just grief they were feeling, it was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances, they happened all the time for months, but what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed, and now whatever had possessed her and killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night, as the sun started to go down, normally kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, no, come inside, it's not safe outside. And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at, and they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they're looking at her, and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked, even though for the past 45 minutes, she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face, and then she stood up, and as she did, the medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet because she was a little bit wobbly. And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse, he looked in her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I'm okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy, and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately, the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances, when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused. And so they all just kind of assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they've seen, but she's just confused. She'll be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. And then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she'd likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You're not my family, this is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Duetti and her in-laws had killed her.
Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance, but nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku, but when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school, and so did not know how to write, but now suddenly in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that time, she likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was. And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day, on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door, as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In fact, most people, including Sumitra and her family, didn't even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He didn't know this guy. He certainly didn't know where he came from. But what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who's dressed in a funny way, who's got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having? And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here, I'll be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around, he walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare, like she had been doing the last few days. But this time she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear, and Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong, but Sumitra's husband couldn't tell what Sumitra had said, and so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband, and apparently it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face, and she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi."
Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over and Sumitra followed him. They sat down, and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he's looked over, and he's got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and he says, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused, and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry, and then she looked at Ram Tripathi and she said, "I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Dwivedi. Shiva Dwivedi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home, 60 miles away, was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares, screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, "Oh, she's sick and we're taking her to the hospital." Now, it was nighttime, there were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors couldn't get a good look at Shiva to see, what was going on with her. And so even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station, and when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head.
Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So when Shiva's in-laws went to them and said, yep, she jumped in front of a train, she committed suicide, but we don't have a body because we already cremated her, the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. Until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19th, 1985, and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes. He brought his leather-bound photo book and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him and then whispered something into his ear that Sumitra's husband saw happening but couldn't hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second. What Sumitra was saying was, Papa. In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed, by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Duety. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998.
16, a woman living in Chicago, Illinois named Jordan Baranskis opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep on the couch the night before. She looked up and the TV was still on, and then she looked down at the other section of the couch and her boyfriend Matt was also asleep on the couch. As much as she wanted to keep sleeping alongside her boyfriend, she had work that day, so she stood up, turned the TV off, and made her way upstairs to get ready. As soon as she got upstairs, the first thing she did is go into her bedroom and get her purse that she left on the foot of her bed. But when she got in the room, her purse wasn't there. So she leaves her bedroom and she starts searching all the rooms upstairs and she can't find her purse. And she's thinking to herself, I'm certain I had it the night before. I remember rifling through my purse before going downstairs and starting to fold laundry before ultimately falling asleep on the couch. So after spending about 15 minutes looking for the purse unsuccessfully, and now she's starting to stress because she's going to be late for work because she can't find her purse,
She goes downstairs and she wakes Matt up and says, "Hey, I gotta find my purse. I thought I left it upstairs. Apparently I didn't. Can you help me look for it?" Matt rolls over. He doesn't really want to get up because he's pretty tired and he doesn't have work, so he doesn't want to wake up right now. And he says, "Well, are you sure you didn't leave it at the restaurant last night? I mean, if you already looked, it's probably not here. You want to just give him a call and see if you left it there?" Jordan was immediately really annoyed by his reaction because she just wanted him to stand up and help her look for the purse because she had work and he could just go back to sleep. And so it started this argument between the two of them where Matt just wanted her to call the restaurant because he was convinced she had it there. And Jordan was like, "No, I know I had my purse. I'm positive I had it last night before I fell asleep on the couch with you." So their argument begins to escalate a little bit, and that's when Jordan remembers that they had recently installed a Nest camera downstairs to monitor their dogs whenever they were gone. And she thought, we can just look at the footage on the Nest camera, we can see me walking into the apartment, and I will either have or not have my purse in my hand. And so Jordan opens up her app and she calls Matt over and they go back to the night before, right before they left for the restaurant. She's got her purse in hand, they leave the front door, and then several hours go by and they come back in and very clearly Jordan has her purse in her hand. And Jordan turns to Matt and says, "Told you so." And Matt's like, "Okay, fine, let me help you look." And as they're about to put the app down, she realizes on the Nest camera timeline that motion was detected at 3:30 in the morning when they were both clearly asleep on the couch. And so she calls Matt back over and says, "Here, look, there's motion detected at 3:30 in the morning." And they hit play. After the couple had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on, a hooded figure emerges from their upstairs hallway and stands at the top of the stairs and just watches the two of them sleep. Before he left, he stole her purse along with a couple of other things from their apartment. And somehow this guy has never been caught and he's been given the nickname Creeper Ghost. Edna Centrone was born on October 10th, 1954 in Puerto Rico, and she was brought to New York by her mother when she was about 5 years old. Edna's family had no money. Her mother, who supported her, was a clerical worker at the New York City Board of Education, where she would bring 2 boiled eggs to work every day so that she wouldn't have to pay for lunch. Edna's family lived in Lower Manhattan on Delancey Street, a neighborhood that was famous for waves of ethnic immigration. Edna had a tough childhood, but she would say she was loved and had enough. In 1987, Edna would meet her future husband, William. William had been visiting his brother at his brother's girlfriend's house in Upper Manhattan. When William walked into the kitchen, Edna was sitting there, and he was so struck with her beauty, he immediately left the room, found his brother, and said, "Who is that woman sitting in the kitchen?" And his brother would tell him that that was Edna. William went right back into the kitchen, and the two of them hit it off right away, and almost immediately they were dating. Every morning, William would leave his Brooklyn apartment and drive all the way to the north end of Manhattan. He would pick up Edna and then drive her to Midtown where she worked. And then he would fight traffic to go to his job. So it was just this horrible, horrible morning commute. But he loved Edna so much, he had no problem in the world doing it. Any chance he got to be around Edna, he was happy. A couple of months after they met, Edna would move in with William in his apartment in Brooklyn, and then 2 years later, they would get married. They discovered that Edna was not able to have kids of her own, and so they talked about adopting, and they were really excited about it, but they kept pushing it off for financial reasons. Like a lot of other couples in their neighborhood, they both had to work multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. Edna worked Monday through Friday as an administrative assistant for Marsh & McLennan, which was a large insurance broker located in the World Trade Center. William was a doorman in an apartment building on the swanky Upper East Side. Monday through Friday, after he was done working as a doorman at about 3 p.m., he would go to Harlem, where he and Edna owned a small flower shop, and he would work there until 8 p.m. at night. And then over the weekends, he and Edna would work at the flower shop. For fun, they liked to drive north to Bear Mountain State Park, where they would meet up with friends and relatives for barbecues and cookouts. And anytime they had a little bit of extra money, they loved going to Atlantic City and spending a little bit of cash on the slots and then taking advantage of the free food that came with gambling. But more than anything else, William and Edna got the most enjoyment out of each other. They were madly in love and inseparable for all 14 years they were together. That even on their worst days, when they came home and things just weren't right, they would always sit down together and they would eat their favorite ice cream and watch their favorite TV show together. On September 11, 2001, William dropped Edna off at the World Trade Center where she worked. She made her way up to the 93rd floor of the North Tower where Martian McLennan was. She took her seat at her desk and began the day like any other day. At 8:46 a.m. that morning, a plane that had been hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists intentionally flew into the North Tower, crashing into floors 93 through 99. Everyone on board the plane and hundreds of people inside the towers where it was struck were killed instantly. Edna survived the initial crash, but she, like everybody else who was at floor 92 and up inside the North Tower on 9/11, were all trapped. Shortly after the crash, a cameraman on the ground was filming the impact site on the side of the World Trade Center, and they inadvertently captured Edna Centrone coming to the edge, clutching onto a metal girder, and she appears to be waving as if she's hoping someone is going to come up here and save her. But of course, there was no way to get to her, and she, like so many others that were trapped inside of the Twin Towers, had to make the terrible choice of waiting for the fire to consume me or jumping out this window. We don't know what her final choice was. However, we do know she was one of the 2,976 people who lost their life during that terrorist attack. On September 22nd, 2006, 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle. Cassie was very responsible, and so her aunt and uncle didn't just trust her to house-sit, they also regularly asked her to babysit their son. During this particular house-sitting weekend, Casey had invited her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, over to the residence to watch a movie with her. She had also invited two other friends named Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, who were classmates of her and Matt's. And so while the four teens are watching this movie, Brian and Tori kind of awkwardly stand up and announce to the other two that they don't want to watch a movie on the TV, they want to go watch a movie in the movie theater, and they promptly leave. Cassie and Matt thought it was a little bit odd that they would come over here specifically to watch a movie with them, only to say, we don't want to watch a movie with you guys, we want to watch it in the theater, but they didn't think much of it and they stayed to finish the movie. Unbeknownst to Cassie and Matt, when Brian and Tori left, they actually looped around to the back of the residence and unlocked the basement door so they could quietly re-enter later. Because these boys had been planning to do something absolutely horrible to Cassie, and they planned on doing it that night. Brian and Tori idolized serial killers. When Brian and Tori happened to watch the movie Scream together, which is a popular horror movie where this masked villain sneaks into teenagers' homes and terrorizes them, they decided that that would be the way they gained infamy. They would reenact the murder scenes from the movie Scream, but in real life. Shortly after this revelation, they begin filming themselves as they come up with their big plan of how they're going to break into someone's home and what they're going to do to them. And at some point on camera, they would say that they've identified their first victim, and it's going to be Cassie Jo Stoddart. They just needed to wait for a time when she was going to be alone. And when they found out she was going to be house sitting over that weekend in September for her aunt and uncle, they put their plan into motion. But when they showed up and Matt Beckham was there, Cassie's boyfriend, it kind of screwed up their plan. And so that's why Brian and Tori had stood up and said they were going to go watch a movie at the movie theater, because what they really wanted to do was come back later when Matt wasn't there anymore so they could attack Cassie. So Brian and Tori leave, and they do go to the movie theater, and they do buy tickets because they figure this is a great opportunity to create a solid alibi for themselves. But they don't stick around for the movie. They get back in their car, and they drive around and film themselves excitedly talking about how great it's going to be when Cassie's all alone and they can attack her. After a couple of hours of driving around, they can't wait any longer, and they figure that Matt must be gone by now. They park at the end of the street, they get out, they put on their masks and their gloves, and they sneak around to the side of the house where there was that open door that Brian had left. They open it up and they go inside of the residence where Cassie was, and they can hear upstairs that Matt is still there. Brian and Tori at this point felt so committed that they just said, you know what, we're gonna have to kill Matt too. So straight out of a horror movie, Brian and Tori hide in the basement wearing their masks and their gloves, they've got their knives, and they start making all this noise to try to get Cassie and Matt to come downstairs to see what's making all the sound. But it doesn't work. They don't come downstairs. So the next thing they do is they go to the circuit breakers and they cut the power to the house. hoping that Matt and Cassie will come downstairs to try to turn it back on. But again, Matt and Cassie stay upstairs. And so Brian and Tori turn the power back on and just continue to make sounds in the basement in hopes that Matt or Cassie, or hopefully both, would come downstairs so they could live out this fantasy. Meanwhile, upstairs, Matt and Cassie hadn't heard any of the sounds going on in the basement, but when the power went out, Cassie got really frightened and she asked Matt would he please stay with her overnight, and so Matt calls his mom and asks if that would be okay, and she says no, but you can invite Cassie over to our house and she can stay with us, and then tomorrow morning I'd be happy to drive her back to her aunt and uncle's house. But at the time the offer was made, the lights had come back on and Cassie had kind of calmed down and said, you know what, Matt, I'm actually just fine. I'm going to stay here. At approximately 10:30 p.m. that night, Brian and Tori could hear Matt's mom showing up, picking him up and taking him home. And they were fairly certain that Cassie was alone, but they were going to wait for a couple minutes to make sure she really was. As they were waiting, Matt actually called Tori and said, hey, I just left Cassie's house. Can I come meet up with you guys? And Matt would later tell police that he couldn't really understand what Tori was saying. It was like he was whispering. And so Matt assumed that he must still be in the movie theater watching the movie, and Matt kind of gave up on the idea of meeting up with them and ultimately just hung up. And so after Tori got off the phone with Matt, he turned to Brian and said, she's alone. Matt just said so. Brian and Tori turned the power off once again and then walked up the stairs and slammed a closet door in hopes that it would entice her to come into the basement. But it didn't work because Cassie was horrified. She heard the slamming door, the lights are out and she's all alone, and so she's huddled up on the couch, terrified. So Brian and Tori, frustrated they can't live out their fantasy exactly the way they wanted to by attacking her in the basement, so they go upstairs, walk into the living room where Cassie is huddled on the couch, fearing for her life, and they proceed to stab their friend to death. After the murder, Brian and Tori ran from the house, got in their car, and the first thing they did is they fired up their video camera and they filmed their excited reaction to ending Cassie's life. Brian and Tori believed they had a solid alibi because they had those movie tickets, but after Cassie's body was discovered just a couple of days later, the police immediately went to Matt Beckham, her boyfriend, and started questioning him, and he immediately said, well, Brian and Tori were the only other two people that were with us that night. The police go to Brian and Tori, and under intense questioning, Brian and Tori would confess to what they had done. They were convicted and given life sentences without the opportunity for parole. Here is some of the video footage that was found on their camera.
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie's daughter. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I locked the back doors, so it's all locked. Now we just gotta wait. I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie.
So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's videos, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please give the like button a wedgie, and then also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss